Welcome to Japanese Religion. This is a series of videos providing an introduction to traditional Japanese religion with a focus on Shinto and Buddhism. In this part, we're going to provide an introduction to Japanese religion in general with a focus on Shinto. So here's a map of Japan just for some geographical context. Japan is an archipelago of islands off the coast of East Asia. The largest island is Honshu in the center. There's Hokkaido in the north, and in the south are the two smaller islands, Kyushu and Shikoku. You'll notice the modern capital of Tokyo is in central Honshu. Historically, the main capitals were Kyoto and Nara, which you can see to the west in southern Honshu. Traditional Japanese religion is a combination of Shinto and Buddhism. An example of this is the altar in the picture on the right, which is at the Shinto shrine Jogyo-ji, dedicated to the kami or god Inari. And you can see some Buddhist icons present there as well. There's a seated Buddha and a pagoda. But there's also foxes, which symbolize the kami Inari, or his messengers. This is called Shinbutsu Shugo in Japanese, which means combining Shinto and Buddhism. Religious syncretism is combining beliefs and practices from multiple religions. It's fairly common in parts of Asia, at least traditionally, where Buddhism would often be combined with the local or native religion. In Japan, traditionally Taoism and Confucianism were also very influential. So Taoism, Confucianism came to Japan from China, and Japanese Buddhism was also historically influenced by Chinese Buddhism. So religious identity is a somewhat complicated topic in Japan. You'll see from the data on the table on the right that over 50% of Japanese do not consider themselves religious, but they may be characterized as practicing folk Shinto. The idea is that the term religion in Japanese has a somewhat narrow connotation. If you belong to a religion or shukyo, then you belong to a specific organized sect or religion that has a more or less officially defined set of doctrines, clergy, canonical scriptures, etc. So that only applies to less than 50% of Japanese people. However, a majority of Japanese people do participate in Shinto and Buddhism, at least in a small way. And many of these people, or most of them, do not consider themselves religious. So they may visit a Shinto shrine or a Buddhist temple to pray for a blessing. It's very common to have Shinto weddings and Buddhist funerals in Japan. And many people also participate in Shinto festivals. And you'll notice on the data on the right, only 4% belong to Shinto organizations. So that's referring not to Shinto in general, but rather to organized sects of Shinto, which are a more recent phenomenon. So a lot of people participate in this kind of popular, common, or folk religion that includes both Shinto and Buddhism. It's similar to how the Christian holiday of Christmas is a part of American culture, so that people who don't consider themselves Christian, or they may be Christian in name but aren't very religious, they still could participate in the holiday. That's somewhat similar to how a lot of Shinto and Buddhist customs or ceremonies are spread throughout the common life in Japan. So in this video, we're going to focus on Shinto. Shinto is the indigenous or native religious tradition to Japan that goes back to ancient times, and Buddhism came to Japan later on. Shinto literally means way of the spirits, and the essence of the religion is honoring the kami at shrines and at festivals in their honor. The word kami can be translated as God or spirit. That's the best way of translating it in a simple way. However, it has a much broader meaning. the basic idea is that it can refer to anything sacred that's worthy of reverence or worship. Now, in Japanese, they also use the word shin as the same meaning as kami. Shin is the Japanese way of spelling or pronouncing the Chinese word shen. You'll notice a lot of Japanese religion uses some Chinese influenced terminology. Historically, Chinese literature, writing, culture, religion had a big impact on Japanese culture, including their religion. So Shinto is a kind of adapted way of saying Shen Dao, which would be Chinese for the way, Dao, of the spirits, Shen. So they're using this Chinese word that means spirit. It can also mean something spiritual as a translation of their term kami. But do keep in mind the word kami does have this broader meaning. It can include other sacred things. So the word usually used for shrine is jinja. And this is basically a sacred building where you can honor one or more kami. So the picture on the right is of one of the worship halls at Izumo Shrine. This, according to tradition, is the oldest shrine in Japan, and it's associated with the creation of the island. It's supposed to, basically that location played a part in the creation story, not of the whole world, but of the island of Japan by two kami, Izanagi and Izanami. There's also a belief that visiting the shrine helps someone seeking a marriage partner. You'll often see that in Shinto, that shrines or the kami associated with them have particular functions. You can go to them for healing, you can go to them for help with your exams or studies, you can go to them to find a marriage partner, etc. And that probably also explains why they're still a part of the popular culture in Japan, because they have that kind of practical function you can go to get some specific blessing. So we need to make a distinction between two main types of Shinto, which has already been implicit in what we've been saying: shrine Shinto versus sect Shinto. When I use the word Shinto, I'll generally be talking about shrine Shinto. This is the folk religion that is focused on worshiping kami at shrines and in matsuri or festivals. This is the type of Shinto that a majority of Japanese participate in. We can also talk about sect Shinto. There are organized religions in Japan that are Shinto in character. They're focused on the kami or a particular kami. These would count as shugyo or religions. And these emerged basically in the last few centuries. They're not as old as shrine Shinto or Shinto in general. The picture on the right is from another very important Shinto shrine, Ise Grand Shrine. This one is dedicated to the sun goddess Amaterasu, who's believed to be the ancestor of the emperors of Japan. So Shinto is unlike a lot of other religions in that it is more of an orthopraxy than an orthodoxy. So orthopraxy means right practice. Orthodoxy means right belief. So Shinto doesn't have a lot of organized doctrines. The main focus of the religion is performing ceremonies and participating in festivals that honor the kami. But what you believe about the kami or their nature can be largely up to individual conscience. There aren't official doctrines about that. There are ways you are supposed to behave at Shinto shrines. There are ceremonies you're supposed to follow, for example, clapping your hands when praying to the kami. But there are no specific beliefs you're required to have in order to do that. And most Shinto beliefs are based on unwritten traditions and customs passed down orally or just through tradition, not on scriptures. Shinto can be regarded as a form of animism, at least in its inception, which is religion focused on worshiping spirits of nature and other spirits. So this is the oldest type of human religion. Shinto was influenced by Buddhism and other things later on in its development as well. Even though there aren't a canonical set of Shinto scriptures, there's no Shinto Bible, for example, there are ancient Japanese texts that contain myths and legends of the Shinto kami. The two most important ones are the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. The Kojiki is the oldest text from Japan. It's actually written in classical Chinese because that was the first writing system that came to Japan. It dates back to the 8th century, early 8th century CE, but it contains much older traditions, going back at least several centuries, if not longer. And the Kojiki does record a creation myth and many stories of the great kami, or gods and goddesses, as well as their genealogies as well of the human emperors and legends of human heroes. The Nihon Shoki is the second oldest Japanese text, and it has at its beginning a creation myth and many legends. And later on, it's more of a historical chronicle of the Japanese emperors. The picture on the right is not from the original manuscript of the Kojiki. No such manuscript survives. This is one of the older ones from the 14th century. Basically, the way we can date the Kojiki is the style of the writing and other factors like when it was known to be composed in the specific time of the specific date of a certain emperor's reign, etc. But this is one of the older surviving manuscripts. So there are many types of kami. The first type we can talk about is corresponding to the English word God. There's actually a specific Japanese word for this type of kami, omi kami, which basically means like a greater spirit, a greater kami. So two examples of this are Izanagi and Izanami. These were not the oldest of the gods, the first gods that created the whole world or universe. Shinto does have a creation myth that does start with other kami. There's actually a whole series of kind of like spontaneously generated kami and several generations that together create the world or the universe. There is no single supreme creator god in at least traditional Shinto. And Izanagi and Izanami are from a later generation of kami. They are special though because they created the islands of Japan. It's worth noting that the lack of a supreme creator god and also the remoteness of the creator gods is somewhat common among animistic and polytheistic religions, where, for example, if you look at the ancient Greek polytheistic religion, the earliest gods involved in the creation were not those most commonly worshipped by ancient Greeks, so they're somewhat remote, and there were several of them. So the story of the creation of Japan is that Izanagi and Izanami were in the heavens, and below them was kind of like a watery chaos that was kind of all murky and mixed in together. So there was no clear separation between the ocean and dry land. They took a sacred spear, you can see Izanagi doing that in this image, lowered it down into the chaotic sea, and drew up salt. They drew up salt from the seawater, and eventually he was able to create dry land from accumulating the salt that was already there in the sea. And this became the islands of Japan. So later on, they became essentially a married couple, and they performed a ritual mating dance before giving birth to their first offspring. This illustrates the great importance of dances in Shinto. So dances or kagura are often a part of Shinto ceremonies, and they're usually performed by priests or shrine maidens. These are types of Shinto clergy. And they're often basically imitating, at least according to tradition, dances that were performed by the kami themselves. So there was a mating dance, but Izanami, according to the traditional account from the Kojiki, basically violated the protocol by she was the one who was speaking first instead of Izanagi after their dance had concluded. And the implication seems to be that it's wrong for the woman or the female to speak first before the male. And this actually created a flaw in the ritual. So their first offspring, Hiruko, was malformed, eel-like. He didn't have legs or arms, for example. He looked kind of like a wriggling eel. He was cast into the ocean. Later on, he became the kami of the sea, and fishermen will return to him later. So they did go on to have other offspring. They had several offspring, and then Izanami died after giving birth to the god or kami of fire, Kagutsuchi. Basically, she was burned while giving birth. She went to the underworld. Izanagi was very sorrowful after the death of his spouse Izanami. So he journeyed to the underworld, Yomi, which is where the dead were believed to go in Shinto. And he was trying to bring her back to the world of the living, back to the surface world. He was instructed not to look back at her, but he, out of curiosity, did. And then she basically turned into an evil demon who is pursuing him with the aid of a bunch of other like underworld, you could call them demons or undead. And he was forced to flee to the surface after he saw her decayed body. When he came to the surface, he had to perform a purification ritual, bathing himself in clean, pure water to get rid of the taint of death and the underworld. Purifying rituals with water are a very important part of Shinto. You have to perform a ritual like that, cleansing your hands and face before you go into a Shinto shrine. After this purification ritual, Izanagi actually gave birth to or created some more kami. The sun goddess Amaterasu was born from his left eye, the moon god Tsukiyomi was born from his right eye, and the storm god Susanoo was born from his nose. So this is an example of two kami that are gods, and it's also an example of the many different creation stories, myths, and legends that surround the kami. Many of them are quite colorful, some of them even shocking and disturbing in terms of their events. A second type of kami is spirits or yokai. Yokai is one of the terms for spirits. The yokai in particular are often monstrous or strange. Now these are not always regarded as kami, that is, not always regarded as things worthy of reverence or worship, but some of them are. Tengu are monstrous birds that are, in their role as kami, can be protectors of forests and mountains. So you might pray to the kami who's the protector of a forest that you live in or are walking through. Kappa are river spirits who do have a reputation for loyalty, but they also have been known to drown people. So they have a mixed nature. They can be dangerous. That's true of a lot of the yokai. Yurei is a term for ghosts or spirits of the dead. And oftentimes when they come back, they may be upset with something from their previous lifetime. So they could be overcome by some extreme emotion like anger, hatred, jealousy, sadness, or grief. And they can be dangerous if they're not appeased or if they're not responded to properly. So Yurei is still, in particular, is still a part of kind of Japanese popular culture, you might say. Another type of kami is sacred persons. These are human beings who are regarded as kami or sacred. The premier example of that is the Tenno, the Emperor of Japan. That title literally means heavenly sovereign. The first emperor was Tenno Jimmu. He was the great-grandson of Ninigi, who was the grandson of Amaterasu, the kami of the sun. And he was also descended from Susanoo, the kami of the sea and storms. Jimmu was the founder of the Yamato kingdom, which was the first centralized government of Japan. According to tradition, this was founded on February 11th, 660 BCE or BC. Modern scholars would put that date forward over 1,000 years, though. Another type of kami is an object that's regarded as sacred. The premier example of this is the three sacred treasures of Japan, also called the imperial regalia. These are objects of heavenly origin. They were created or discovered by kami. They symbolize the authority of the emperor. So whoever wields them symbolically has the authority of the kami to rule. And they were brought to Japan by Ninigi, the ancestor of the first emperor, Jimmu. The three sacred objects are a mirror, a sword, and a gem. The mirror is called Yata no Kagami, and it symbolizes wisdom. It's believed to be housed at Ise Grand Shrine. The sword is Kusanagi. It symbolizes valor or courage, and it's believed to be housed at the Atsuta Shrine in Nagoya. The jewel is called Yasakani no Magatama. Magatama means jewel or gem, and it symbolizes compassion. And it is believed to be present at the Kashiko Dokoro at the Tokyo Imperial Palace. We don't know exactly what these look like because they are never shown in public. This is an artist's reconstruction of what they may look like or may have looked like based on artifacts discovered through archaeology from the period in which they may have been created. These may have actually been lost or damaged. We know that at least some of them were damaged in a fire historically. And they are present in ceremonies involving the emperor. However, as mentioned, they are never displayed to the public. By the way, the shape of that gemstone, it looks like a little curved bean, or it actually is similar to the tooth of an animal. It is kind of like a jade bead. That was the common shape of magatama, or gems, in ancient Japan. That dates back to early in Japanese history when they made jewelry from polished stones and later from polished jade. Another type of kami is sacred places. Probably the premier example of that is Fujisan, or Mount Fuji. Fuji is a large volcano in Japan, and it's believed to be itself a kami, or a sacred being. And there are a series of temples within sight of Mount Fuji that are dedicated to honoring the kami of Fuji. Another example is the Meoto Iwa, or Wedded Rocks. These actually symbolize the other kami, Izanagi and Izanami, and they're connected to the creation story of Japan. But they also seem to be regarded as sacred objects in their own right, or sacred places. So let's get through some particular examples of kami, and the ones we're going to look at all correspond to the Omi kami, or gods, for the most part. Amaterasu is the kami of the sun, also of the day, because the sun brings the day. She's also associated with the heavens in general, and the Japanese nation, because she's the ancestor of the emperors of Japan. Also, the name for Japan in Japanese, Nihon, is the land of the rising sun. And one way of understanding this is that Japan is the first land, essentially, in Asia that sees the rising sun, because they're the main eastern island archipelago. And they believe that they were the first ones in the world to see the rising sun every morning. Here's one story about Amaterasu that's often depicted in paintings of her. It's her emerging from the cave called Ama no Iwato. The story is that she was insulted by her older brother, Susanoo, and then they had a contest to see who could create the most gods. So somewhat bizarrely, Amaterasu took Susanoo's sword, and Susanoo took Amaterasu's necklace. And they each, I think, chewed up and spat out that object, and then gods were born from the object after they had chewed it up and spat it out. Susanoo, after taking the necklace, was able to create 5 gods. Amaterasu, after taking the sword, was able to create 3. And you might think that that means that Susanoo won. But Amaterasu said, no, since you used my necklace to create the gods, I win. So this drove Susanoo into a fury, and he basically went on a rampage, destroying or damaging the heavens and the earth, destroying a lot of rice fields of Amaterasu. He actually killed her maidservant, and he threw a flayed horse or pony onto her loom that she would use to create fabric. So really kind of disgusting, horrifying, also very insulting. Amaterasu did not respond to this well. She was overcome with grief and anger, and so she hid herself in a cave. However, since she was the kami of the sun, this plunged the world into darkness. So the other kami were disturbed by this, and they gathered outside of the cave, and they were trying to coax her out. They eventually succeeded by throwing an impromptu party and performing a dance outside the cave. She was kind of curious and intrigued to what was going on, and she finally came out, bringing light back into the world. Another example of an Omi kami or god is Tsukiyomi. He is the kami of the moon and the night, and he's the younger brother of Amaterasu. You may recall he was born when Izanagi was washing his right eye after emerging from the underworld. He was actually married to Amaterasu. One of these stories is that he was involved in is that he killed another kami, Ukemochi, who is the goddess of food, when she made a feast in a disgusting way. So after this murder, Amaterasu shunned him, separating from him, and this is the traditional account for how day and night separated. You'll notice the image of Tsukiyomi on the right is a modern painting. This one I believe is from the 1990s. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a more traditional interpretation of the kami, although this is actually similar to other images of him that would be traditionally used. That was in the public domain. Most of the art and images I'm taking is from Wikimedia Commons. So in this case, it was either a painting from the 90s or a version of Tsukiyomi from anime or a video game. So I went with the painting. Another kami is Susanoo. He is the ruler of the sea and storms, and he's the older brother of Amaterasu, born when Izanagi washed his nose after purifying himself from leaving the underworld. So he had that famous contest with Amaterasu. After he went on his rampage, he was banished from heaven. So he came to the earth. One of the stories after he came to the earth is that he met an elderly couple that had a series of daughters who were being devoured by a serpent, an evil serpent, kind of like a dragon, named Yamata no Orochi. And Susanoo decided to do a good deed by fighting that serpent and killing it. You can see that happening in the image on the right. After he had defeated the serpent, he actually bizarrely found a sword embedded in the serpent's tail. There is a kind of tradition in Japan, this is somewhat true of China as well, of the body parts of dragons being or containing sacred objects like gems. In this case, though, it was a sword. And he decided to give this sword, Kusanagi, as a gift to Amaterasu, kind of like a peace offering. Amaterasu accepted it and gave the sword in turn to her grandson Ninigi, and that's how it came into the possession of the Japanese emperors. Another kami is Ebisu. He's the kami of fish, fishermen, wealth, and fortune or good luck. So he basically is a transformed version of the kami Hiruko. Hiruko was the first child of Izanagi and Izanami that came out somewhat deformed after Izanami broke the protocol after their mating dance. So he was born without bones, arms, or legs. So he was kind of eel-like or maybe like worm-like. However, eventually, after he was cast into the sea around the age of 3, he grew arms and legs, and he still looked somewhat odd, but he became the kami Ebisu, who's associated with fish and fishermen. This, according to scholars, this may have been a conflation originally of two different kami, but he's one of the most popular kami who's still worshipped, especially by fishermen. Another kami, and this one I think has the largest number of shrines dedicated to him, is Inari. Inari is the kami of rice, primarily, also of foxes, tea, fertility, and prosperity. So traditionally, he was the patron of smiths, including both blacksmiths and smiths who made swords, of warriors, and of merchants. Interestingly, Inari can be depicted either as male or as female or as androgynous. So oftentimes when Inari is depicted as male, he's in the form of an old farmer or an old man. Or when he's depicted as female, he's in the form of a beautiful maiden with a long flowing dress. And Inari can also be depicted as androgynously, not being clearly of either sex. So Inari is also associated with foxes because he has a bunch of white foxes who serve him as messengers. His original association was as the kami of rice and kind of like of grain and farming generally. That may be why he's the most popular or widely worshipped Inari, at least a kami, at least in terms of the number of shrines. Hachiman is probably the second most popular in terms of number of shrines. We have to bear in mind too that Amaterasu, the sun kami, and the emperor Tenno are worshipped very prominently by Japanese, but after them you could say that it's Inari and Hachiman. Hachiman traditionally was the patron of soldiers and farmers, and he's regarded as the protector of Japan and of the emperor specifically. He was worshipped by the Minamoto clan, which was a samurai clan from Japan, and then his worship spread to a lot of other samurai. And he also became associated with Japanese Buddhism. He's connected to a bodhisattva. He's regarded essentially as a manifestation or incarnation of a bodhisattva. And this is an illustration of how Shinto to some extent became fused with or connected to Buddhism and traditional Japanese religion. You can see in the image of Hachiman on the right, he is shaven-headed like a Buddhist monk. He's holding a mala, Buddhist prayer beads, and he has a halo around his head like the way Buddhas and bodhisattvas are depicted in Buddhism. And finally, he's sitting on a lotus flower, the symbol of Buddhist enlightenment. And a final example of a kami is Tenjin. He's the patron of students and scholars, so he's very popular around exam time. The belief is that you can pray to him and he may help you with your exams. He's the deified form of Sugawara no Michizane, who is a real person. So some kami are actually deified forms of actual human beings. So Michizane was a scholar and a poet during the Heian period of Japanese history. He was connected to the court of the emperor. However, he was forced into exile by rivals, and he died not that long after he went into exile in, I think it was Kyushu, south of Honshu. So after his death, however, there were fires and floods that were plaguing the Fujiwara clan, the ones who had forced him into exile. This was a clan of nobles who had gained power over the emperor by this point. However, there were storms that both set fire to some of the Fujiwara houses because of lightning and caused flooding. So this was interpreted as the spirit of Michizane enacting his revenge upon the Fujiwara. The court of the emperor concluded Michizane was responsible, and so they started worshiping him as the kami Tenjin. So at first he was somewhat a protector against fire and flood and storms, but later on he became mainly associated with his scholarship. In his life, he was one of the main scholars and poets of the court of the emperor of this time. He's also associated with plum blossom trees because that was his favorite type of tree. And indeed, according to tradition, there is a plum blossom tree that magically transported from where it was in the capital of the emperor to where he was in exile, so that it could be there with him. And that tree is still honored in a shrine dedicated to Tenjin to this day.